Welcome back. So we're talking about the reading, which was about Aristotle's Politics. So here's Aristotle, or a sculpture of Aristotle, very famous philosopher. He was writing kind of just after the period that we talked about in the last lecture. So he was alive in the 300s BC. And before we talk about him, I want to talk about his mentor and his mentor's mentor, um, because they are some of the biggest names in philosophy, and it's good to help sort of situate where we're at. So Socrates, you may have heard of, right? So here's a picture of Socrates, or a sculpture of Socrates. Notice kind of a goofy looking guy, which was sort of a big deal in ancient Greece. He's Ancient Greeks really cared a lot about whether you were good looking. It was kind of to them indicated that you had like you were a good person or had a good soul or something. So Socrates, who was sort of people found very annoying, but was widely renowned as like the most, the smartest, right, wisest person out there. It was sort of confusing to people that he had this sort of snub nose and was kind of a little portly, kind of a goofy looking guy, right? So that's Socrates. Um, Huge figure in the history of philosophy. So, I mean, so much so that any philosopher before Socrates, we call them pre-Socratic, right? The dividing line, like AD and BC. Um, Another interesting thing is Socrates never wrote a single book. Um, all he did was hang around the center of town. I mean, he had a day job. He was like, he had land and he was sort of a farmer, but he would hang around town as much as he could and just talk to people. And in those conversations, he sort of encouraged people to question their assumptions about what was just or what is knowledge. A lot of the basic questions that we study in philosophy today, the nature of knowledge, the nature of right and wrong, and so on, um, the nature of the mind. So he would just talk to people about these things, right? People came in often with a certain amount of prejudice or thinking they knew something, right? Um, and he would sort of, by asking them questions, make them realize that they were contradicting themselves or that they didn't know as much as they thought they knew. And often his conversations ended up in what they called aporia, which is just like confusion. Like, I don't know, I thought I knew something. Now I don't know much, but I know that what I thought I knew was probably wrong, right? But in the process, they've clarified what the problem is. They've clarified some of the concepts involved. Um, so uh, I'm trained in philosophy, and I know that people find this sort of thing annoying, right? So, and even in Socrates' time, um, people don't particularly like being questioned or don't particularly like being shown that what they thought they knew they don't know. Uh, Particularly people that have a some sort of dogmatic religious agenda or political agenda. And so in the end, Socrates was executed, right? He was someone that he had annoyed, um, trumped up some charges that he was like corrupting the youth and was, atheistic. And that was the bad thing even in a polytheistic society like Greece, right? So even though there were lots of different gods you could believe in, accusing someone of not believing in the gods, uh, still a bad thing. So he was tried and executed, famously drank hemlock poison and died. So again, Socrates died never having written any of his philosophy down, but one of his students, Plato, wrote a lot, right? And he preserved um, everything. The vast majority of what we know about Socrates comes from Plato. So pretty much all of his books have Socrates as the main character, and they take the form of a dialogue. So there's usually two characters, sometimes more, but the main two characters, Socrates and the person he's talking to, right, which they call his interlocutor. And so it's reflects how we think he lived his life, walking around, just running into people in the marketplace and talking to them. And so they'll meet somewhere. They're written like a play. Here's what Socrates says. Here's what, you know, his interlocutor says, and so on. And they discuss some philosophical topic, usually end up not really realizing, oh, I thought I knew some stuff, but now I guess I don't, and then parting ways. So Plato uses Socrates to kind of, it's hard to disentangle, right? When Plato uses Socrates in one of his dialogues, how much is actually reflects the historical Socrates and how much is Plato putting his own agenda into Socrates' mouth. We kind of have to, it's hard, almost, it's impossible to disentangle them, right? But Plato's approach, at any rate, is what we call a priori, um, which just means primarily using logic and reason uh, to learn things about the world, right, rather than your senses. Um, he's very skeptical about how useful the senses are and the empirical world, which empirical we mean the world revealed to us by our senses, the things we see, smell, hear. Um, usually what we consider to be the basis of most of our knowledge. Plato was very suspicious of it, thought it was very unreliable. Obviously sometimes our senses do fool us, right? And he thought, well, if they fool us once, who knows when they could be fooling us, right? And maybe they're fooling us all the time, roughly. Um, so he was much more in favor of true knowledge is knowledge of the realm of forms, which is some sort of abstract plane where we existed before we were born, right? We come to Earth when we're born, and everything we know, insofar as we know it, is actually remembered from the world of the forms. It doesn't really come from our senses. So his approach, we can contrast that with Aristotle's. So Aristotle was a pupil of Plato, um, but ended up with a very different philosophical method. He was very much a scientist. He preferred scientific investigation, right? Used, again, was aware that sometimes the senses can fool us, but largely used the senses and empirical knowledge, right, to understand the world. And he wrote on a wide variety of topics: physics, biology, politics, ethics, more metaphysics, more abstract philosophy. Here's a famous sort of Renaissance era painting where we have Plato and Aristotle. Plato's on the left, Aristotle's on the right. Plato's pointing up, right, kind of towards the heavens, towards the world of the forms. Aristotle's saying, hey, let's keep it, right, down here with the world of the senses, and it sort of is metaphorical of their different approaches. So what we're going to read from Aristotle is his book on politics, right, on how cities should be run, how states should be run. And he's writing it in part to as a refutation of a very famous book by Plato called The Republic. So Plato also wrote a book on politics. Um, Plato's book on politics is in the end ends up being fairly radical. So he thinks that states should be run by philosophers, right? The philosophers are the smartest people, right? That have the most wisdom, most knowledge about the nature of justice. Then they should be the ones running countries. He also thinks that Plato thinks that we shouldn't have like families, like mom, dad, and the kids. That they should be abolished in favor of these more communal arrangements, right? People should be raised not to like love and support their families, but to love and support the state, right? So you have a stronger uh, civic community. So that's pretty wild. And Aristotle sort of pulls it back um, to something that feels a little more uh, normal to us, right? So again, he's a naturalist, right? So he wants to look first at human nature, right? Empirically, say, okay, how do humans behave? What is the nature of humans? And then, given that, what would be the best sort of community or state for humans to live in? So, Aristotle thinks that humans are essentially political animals. Um, so, the polis, which is the Greek word for the state, for them, it was those city states that we talked about last time. He says that's a natural phenomenon, just as natural as eating and sleeping and growing hair. We also form states, right? This is just what humans do. And in fact, given the way Aristotle thinks about causation, the state is sort of logically prior to the existence of humans in a way, which might sound a little weird, right? But basically, the idea is humans exist in order to form a polis. The polis does not exist to serve pre-existing human desires or needs. So why would he say that? So his argument is, look, we have this natural urge to reproduce and form families, right? And our family's survival, our chances of survival are enhanced, right? Given the sorts of creatures we are, we don't have particularly sharp teeth and we're not particularly fast, right? What we have to do, we do have big brains, and that allows us to get together in groups and plan and problem solve, right? And get together and protect ourselves from lions and bears and then go out and hunt stuff. So the natural, like, best state for humans is to be in a rather relatively large group, larger than a single family. And the larger the village, the larger the state, the better off the humans are, right? And then the polis, he thinks, is like the natural end state where all of a sudden, yeah, we're best off in this size community, which again for them at the time was the city state, which given their technology, perhaps reasonable. Um, the polis, he thinks, so humans naturally on their own are sort of in an unstable state. They're moving toward larger and larger groups and groups. Once they hit a polis, now they're stable, right? That's about the size where they're safe, they're most efficient, and they're not looking for some larger and larger organization. It doesn't need anything else, or doesn't need to develop into anything else. So that's why he thinks it's logically prior to human beings. It's the stable state that our instincts are driving us toward, is to be a member of a polis. Um, this is, in Aristotle's language, uh, final cause of humans. So Aristotle had his concept of causation was a little different than the way we think of it these days, where it's just sort of, I don't know, force moving from one object to another or something like that. He thought of four different types of causes, right? So the example here in this picture is you got a table, right? What's the cause of the table? Well, there's four of them. Material cause is the wood that the table's made of, right? That causes the table to exist. There's also the formal cause, which is sort of the design that whoever created the table had in mind. There's the efficient cause, which is the carpentry that takes the wood and turns it into the table. And then there's the final cause, which is the whole purpose of the table, which is, right? So for humans, our final cause is to exist in a polis, right? That is our goal. And everything is like this for Aristotle. So rocks fall towards the ground because that's their natural place, right? It's not, they didn't know, this is way before Newton. They didn't know about the force of gravity. They thought, yeah, well, rocks belong on the earth. So obviously, if you pick a rock up and let go of it, it's going to want to go back to where it belongs, back to earth, right? Moving towards your natural place is how causation works for Aristotle. Polis is the natural place for the human. That's where we can stop striving towards something bigger and bigger, and we hit our stable state. Um, it is our final cause. Uh, he further supports this claim uh, by his other claim about human nature, which is that we are essentially rational animals, right? We are the only rational animal, the animal that can has logic and can reason. Um, and the ultimate aim of rationality is to do philosophy, according to him. That's the highest form of rationality. But in order to sit around and do philosophy, you need considerable free time, considerable material security, right? Um, and so, in order to have that sort of free time and security, you need to live in a polis, in a nice stable polis. You can't be living in a cave, worrying if lions are going to tear you to bits while you're asleep, right? You need stability, and then you can reach your highest goal, which is to do philosophy. So, interestingly, right, when he talks about human nature, slaves are left out of all of this, right? um, he doesn't think slaves have the same drive to do philosophy, the same level of rationality. He thinks they have a certain level of reasoning. He thinks they can do what we call instrumental reasoning, right? So, if you want to build a table, right, you have to be able to reason and think about, okay, where do I want to fasten the legs? What's the best place to put them? What sort of tool would I need to fasten them in the right way? All that sort of reasoning he thinks slaves are perfectly capable of, right? Or if they're working as farm hands or whatever, they can do reasoning to decide where to spread fertilizer, etc. But he thinks they are naturally incapable of forming the ultimate goal for themselves. Or someone has to tell them to build a table. Someone has to tell them, right, to do the work. Um, and for that, they need a master, right? Um, obviously, this is all terrible, right? This is bad. I'm not like in endorsing this, right? And he really does do a lot of whitewashing of the abuse that slaves received even in ancient Greece. Um, right? He paints a picture as if masters are, taking care of their slaves who are incapable of taking care of themselves and really providing them the best kind of life they can hope for given their, inferior rationality. when in fact they were, yeah, being beaten and sexually abused and all sorts of stuff. And, slaves are no, they're not different types of humans, right? They're just as rational as anyone else. But again, this is in any slavery society, you're going to find ways to excuse it, right? And this was Aristotle's way of excusing it, that slaves lacked the full rationality. Okay, I said that the politics was written in part to critique Plato's Republic. Um, and Plato's Republic describes a sort of state where the philosopher kings pick the most talented people. They tell people who to marry and who to breed with, stuff like that. Everything is planned rationally. Children are raised in these communal sort of barracks. There's no private property. Um, and Plato's reason for this is like, if the goal is a good state, everything has to be aimed at a good state, right? And you can't have people's loyalties divided between the state and the family, right? That's only going to interfere. So the best state, everyone has to not be worried about loving their mother. They have to love, right? This little cartoon here is, "Hey, King Plato, one of your lords has attacked our outpost. We must demand justice." And then here's the philosopher king saying, "Ah, but what even is justice?" What? Well, you say you want justice, so you must know what it is, right? This is exactly what Socrates would do, right? And his minister, or whatever, is saying, "Look, I don't have time for this." So the whole idea of the philosopher king, at least in the um, as if Socrates is the model, then not much would probably get done. Right? And Aristotle also is resisting this idea that the philosopher should be in charge. So again, Plato's point was, we need this unity. Everything needs to be aimed at the state. We can't have divided loyalty. And Aristotle questions that whole premise. Aristotle says, look, actually, maybe we need a diversity of ideas, right? If we want innovation and to improve, we can't get stagnant. Um, and so we do need different ideas and not everybody unified at the same thing. We need certain people that are right concerned about something else and right that I don't care so much about the state, but I really care about whatever improving weaponry or farming techniques, and I'm going to spend all my time at that. And that's how you get innovation. So, right. Second of all, he argues that humans, Plato's trying to cultivate the same, right, a love for the state that replaces your love for family. And Aristotle says, good luck. That's never going to happen, right? That's not human nature. Um, Humans are always going to love their kin, they're more than they're going to care for their fellow citizens. And so he thinks if we adopted Plato's citizen, the bonds between people would be, quote, watery, right? They wouldn't be as strong as the sorts of bonds you form with your family. Um, and finally, he says, look, children raised in a communal barracks would be a bad idea. Parenting is all about this special bond between the parent and the child, right? You have to, I don't know if any of you have kids. I have kids. They're annoying, right? And other people's kids, especially annoying, right? You really have to love the child you're caring for. You have to love in that special way. You know what I mean? In order to get the job done. Again, not that children, foster parents, they can form that kind of bond, right? But Aristotle is arguing that if you're living in a communal barracks, you're not going to have that familial bond that's really important to raising. But so Plato's view was like almost communism, right? Um, and Aristotle's not totally opposed to public goods of a sort, right? He definitely thinks that all children should get an education and all children should get the same education. So he is in favor of a public education, um, and he thinks, in fact, that this can is the main thing that would do the best to accomplish what Plato was hoping for, which is to prevent corruption, right? He wants everybody looking for good of the state, which is supposed to be good for everybody, not looking to enrich themselves, right? And Aristotle thinks um, you don't need to go full communism for that. You just need people to be properly educated. If people are properly educated in ethics, among other things, then they're not going to go around seeking to enrich themselves at the expense of others, right? They will understand right and wrong, and they will um, be looking to, again, for the good of the polis. Um, he also thinks that, when there is surplus production, right, extra wheat or extra grain, that should be made available to the poor. So he does have a sort of welfare system, right? So he's trying to dispute Plato's system, but he's not saying everything about Plato's system is bad. Right? Some of the things could be preserved, but he's trying to focus in on the key things that he thinks will really make it. Okay, so a polis is composed of citizens, right? So Aristotle wants to define what a citizen is and then talk about what makes a good citizen. So he defines a citizen as someone eligible to hold office or serve as a juror in a polis. Um, Practice in Greece, right? That meant everybody but women and slaves, right? And foreigners. So what makes a good citizen is an important question, and he thinks it's a different question than what makes someone a good person. So what makes a good person is ethics, being moral, right? And morality is universal, right? It should apply to slaves, it applies to women, it applies to foreigners, right? Um, it applies to people in Soviet Russia, and it applies to people in capitalist United States. A good citizen, right? What being a good citizen is depends on what kind of state you're in. Right? So a good U.S. citizen would not necessarily be a good citizen of the USSR, right? Um, and so, in order to be a good citizen, you'd have to read his whole book, understand what all the different types of states are, right? What the good version of each of those states are, and then that will give you a start on how you can be a good citizen in that type of state. So, being a good citizen is relative to the sort of state. So, what are the different types of states? Um, so he names three types, right? Each of which has a good and bad version. So you can have rule by one, and that is kingship when it's good, and tyranny when it's bad. You can have rule by a few, which is he calls aristocracy when it's good, and oligarchy when it's bad. Oligarchy should sound familiar, right? That was sort of the starting place in the last lecture of where the Greek states were before they developed Solon and Cleisthenes and the laws that they developed that made the state a bit more democratic, right? So yeah, oligarchy is a few rich folks right, getting together and organizing things to their advantage. Aristocracy is when the rich folks are good, right? Um, Rule by the many can also be good. He calls that a politeia, or it can be bad, and he calls the bad version, interestingly, democracy. Right? So there's six, right? So six total types of states, right? A good and bad version of each of the three. Rule by one, rule by a few, rule by many. The difference between good and bad, he thinks, always lies in whether there's a power imbalance. So you can have uh, too few people in power, right? You can have too many people in power. Um, and the problem with democracy, remember, he thinks democracy is the bad version of rule by the many, is it gives too much power to the lower classes, right? It's not balanced with the upper classes. Um, he doesn't even conceive of a society, which it seems like Plato could conceive more of, where everyone is more or less the same class, right? There's always going to be an upper class and a lower class, and it's always bad either way. If you give the upper class too much authority, then you're in an oligarchy. If they're bad people, if you give the lower classes too much authority, then you're in a democracy, which is bad. And again, the problem there is you can either have too much money or too little money. Aristotle, and this comes up in his Ethics, he's all about what he calls the golden mean, right? So all the virtues, all the good character traits that a person could have lie right in the middle of a continuum, right? So um, courage, for example, lies between cowardice, where you run away in the face of uh, right in the face of the enemy or whatever, and foolishness, where you just run headlong into the enemy and get yourself killed. Right? Courage is right there in the middle. Um, Similarly, with like honesty, you can be too honest, right? And you can, if your friend happens to be wearing a silly looking shirt, you just say, "Man, you look stupid," right? Well, that's not good, right? But then you could also um, that's too honest, but you could also obviously lying is bad, too much is bad too. So, right, honesty is somewhere in the middle there, right? So every good thing is right in the middle. And it's the same with having money, right? You can have too much money, you can have too little money. If you have too much money, you're going to mistreat poor people. If you're too poor, you're going to want to mistreat rich people if you can. So what you need is like to be in the middle. Most of the people be in the middle. You need a big middle class, according to Aristotle. So a good leader, right, and whichever version you find yourself in, the rule by one, rule by a few, rule by many, is going to try to steer the polis towards this ideal middle ground in all things, right, towards this golden mean. So that seems a little weird to say Aristotle is against democracy, right? Is this really the case? I mean, strictly speaking, yes, but it's really just a terminological issue. So obviously he's in favor of a politeia, which is a kind of democracy, right? It's a rule by the many, um, and he thinks that version is good. So in a sense, he's in favor of good democracies. He just happens to use the word democracy for the bad kind. So he's not so much anti-democratic as he just terminology is different than ours. Right? Okay, so far we've got three good kinds of polis, right? So is there a best one, right? Is there an ideal one we should be steering for, right? Do we want a kingship? Do we want, a politeia? Do we want aristocracy? Um, it's hard to say, right? He again interpreting Aristotle is a whole industry that people do. People spend their whole lives and careers doing that. There was someone at UCSD where I got my PhD who's that was his deal, reading Aristotle, even just specifically Aristotle's ethics, right, and trying to make sense of that. So uh, I don't claim to know the answer to some of these interpretive issues, right? But you can look at the text, and he says some things here, he says some things there. The text I had you read was not from Aristotle. I encourage you to take a look at his politics if you get a chance, but it can be tough reading sometimes, and people will often give up. So I read a sort of secondary source that was analyzing Aristotle's politics, and it gave you a broader view. Um, okay, anyways, so what kind of state is the best, right? Well, Aristotle does spend a good amount of time saying that there are benefits when a large group of people come together for some project. And we tend to want him to say something about the politeia, right? The rule by the many, we would hope is the better thing. That tends to be what we believe, right? So he talks about a metaphor of a feast, right? Which is always you're gonna have a better, bigger feast if lots of people participate, right? Um, but really, in the end, it's hard to label Aristotle as a Democrat, right, or as a populist. He seems to think the most important thing is whether the people ruling are good people, right? So a good kingship where the king is a good person is going to be just as good, he thinks, as a good politeia, right? That's ruled by many people that are good. He doesn't seem to really favor one over the other. It's just whether the people are good. Um, and he suggests that even in a politeia, the powers of the assembly should be sort of, again, the assembly is where all the citizens get together and vote on stuff. He thinks that those powers should be sort of limited or split up. He's not really crazy about a single assembly that has total power over everything the state does, and he seems to be much more in favor of a smaller group of representatives, sort of representative democracy. Like you wouldn't use the word democracy, right? But you pick the best people to do the work. I think he's probably realistically and plausibly says in a big group of people, how many of them are really going to be good people? Right? Unlikely. So pick the best ones and have them do most of the work. You know, so we read these ancient authors and we try to figure out what they're saying, but it's also worth asking whether what they're saying is true, right? Um, I'm not like yeah, I tend to think, okay, just because Aristotle said it doesn't mean it's right? So um, there is some empirical evidence that groups of people are better at converging on the correct solution to any given problem than an individual, even if that individual is kind of an expert, right? So it's called the wisdom of crowds, and there's been studies of this. So like, you get a group of people and they guess whatever the weight of a bull or the number of jelly beans in a jar, right? You take all their responses and then you take the average, and that will often tend to be closer to the correct value than the guess of like a butcher or some other expert in the area. So there is something about the wisdom of crowds, right? Of course, this is not exactly the point Aristotle is making, really, right? Because in these studies, you've got people guessing independently about a certain value, and then you're averaging them. in a state, you've got people debating, consulting with each other, right? You've got experts and other people hearing their testimony and making calculations. And so the process of democracy is not exactly the same thing as is being studied in these empirical studies. Um, but that may just mean that may just support Aristotle's view, really, because you might say, well, sure, it's cool that crowds can sort of like on average zoom in on a good on a correct estimate of something, but wouldn't it be better if we could take the wisdom of experts, join it with the wisdom of the crowds? Also, they can talk about it, right? And then come to a decision using all of the best of all the information we have. Maybe we get better results that way, and that is roughly what Aristotle is saying, right? He says um, you can have a great state that's ruled by the many, but also we need to, keep in mind that some people are better than others at statecraft and give them a little bit more disproportionate, power, and also make sure that they have to convince the larger amount of people, right, using reason and stuff, and this way we can. So, I mean, he's a smart fella, right? Aristotle, a lot of what he says rings true to the current day. And it also gives us an insight into the thinking that was going on back then as we prepare to talk about the Roman Empire that took much of their culture um, and some of their political tricks and their philosophy and even their gods from the Greeks, right? So even though, again, Greeks were not an empire, at least until the time of Alexander, certainly not in this time of the ascendancy of Athens as the dominant city state, nonetheless, in Athens of that time lie the seeds, right, of later empires that are very important. So see you next time.